Most people say they want confidence, strength, and clarity, but very few are willing to face the one condition that creates all three, being comfortable alone. Because solitude removes the noise, the validation, the distractions, and the emotional crutches that keep people from seeing who they really are. And when you are alone, with no audience, no approval, and no reaction, your true identity begins to surface. And this is why most people fear being alone, not because solitude is empty, but because it is honest. Because silence exposes habits, weaknesses, unresolved thoughts, and emotional dependencies that constant stimulation hides. And society quietly teaches you to avoid this state by glorifying busyness, connection, entertainment, and endless communication. Not because these things are bad, but because a person who can sit alone comfortably becomes emotionally independent. And emotional independence is dangerous to systems built on insecurity, comparison, and approval. And the Silent Samurai understood this deeply, because warriors were not forged in crowds, they were refined in isolation, where discipline replaced distraction and self-trust replaced validation. And when you begin to spend time alone without numbing it with noise, scrolling, or entertainment, something uncomfortable happens at first. Your mind becomes loud, thoughts rush in, doubts surface, and restlessness appears. But this discomfort is not a problem. It is the doorway, because discomfort is the signal that you are no longer escaping yourself. And most people turn back at this stage, returning to noise and connection to avoid the internal pressure. But the Silent Samurai stays, because staying teaches you to observe thoughts without reacting, emotions without obeying, and impulses without acting. And slowly, as you remain present in solitude, your nervous system begins to settle, your mind becomes clearer, and your emotions lose their urgency. And this is when something powerful happens. You stop needing external input to feel stable. And once that need dissolves, your confidence stops depending on who is watching, who is responding, or who is approving. Because confidence formed in solitude is not performative, it is grounded. And this is why people who are comfortable alone tend to move differently in the world. They speak less, but with more weight. They react less because they are not emotionally hungry, and they are not desperate to be understood because their self-concept is already settled. And this threatens people who rely on constant feedback to feel secure, because emotional dependence creates predictability, while independence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes insecure minds uncomfortable. But the samurai never feared this, because solitude taught him something most people never learn, that being alone does not mean being weak, it means being complete. And when you are complete within yourself, relationships become a choice instead of a necessity. Approval becomes optional, and silence becomes peaceful instead of frightening. And this is the stage where discipline naturally forms, because without distraction, you are forced to confront your routines, your excuses, and your inconsistencies. And solitude quietly demands alignment between what you say and what you do. And when alignment is achieved, confidence becomes inevitable. Not loud confidence, but calm certainty, the kind that does not seek attention, but commands respect. And this is why being comfortable alone is the foundation of inner power. Because if you cannot sit with yourself without escaping, you will always seek escape through people, validation, or noise. And that dependence will shape your decisions, weaken your boundaries, and dilute your identity. But when solitude becomes a place of stability instead of fear, you reclaim authority over your inner world. And once that authority is established, no external chaos can shake you the same way again. When you become comfortable alone, a quiet transformation begins that most people around you cannot explain, but can feel. Because emotional independence changes how you show up in every interaction. You stop over-explaining, stop chasing connection, and stop tolerating relationships that drain you, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. And this clarity comes from knowing that your sense of worth no longer rises or falls based on attention, response time, or validation. And this is where the hidden power of solitude becomes visible to others, even though you never announce it. Because people subconsciously sense when someone does not need them emotionally. And this shifts the balance of every social exchange. Your presence becomes calm instead of needy. Your silence becomes grounded instead of awkward. And your boundaries become firm without being aggressive. And insecure people often misinterpret this as coldness, distance, or superiority. But in reality, it is simply self-containment. And the Silent Samurai accepted this misunderstanding without correction, because explaining emotional independence defeats its purpose. And this is why solitude also refines your social awareness. You begin to notice who seeks connection and who seeks access, who respects silence and who fears it, and who values you for who you are versus how you make them feel. And with this awareness, your circle naturally becomes smaller but stronger, because solitude trains you to choose quality over quantity, depth over noise, and alignment over familiarity. And as this continues, your inner dialogue changes. You become less reactive to criticism, less shaken by rejection, and less tempted to perform for acceptance, because you have already faced yourself without witnesses, and nothing external can threaten a self-concept that was built in silence. And this is why people who master solitude are difficult to manipulate, because manipulation relies on emotional hooks, guilt, fear of abandonment, or need for approval. And solitude quietly removes all of these levers. And once they are gone, you move through life with a steadiness that others feel but cannot disrupt. And the samurai understood that this steadiness is the true mark of strength, not aggression, not dominance, but calm control. And when you carry this control, your life simplifies, decisions become easier, boundaries feel natural, and peace becomes your default state, not something you chase. And this is the final truth most people never reach, that being comfortable alone does not isolate you from the world. It prepares you to engage with it without losing yourself. Because solitude teaches you who you are before the world tells you who to be. And once that identity is set, you can enter crowds without dissolving, relationships without dependency, and challenges without panic. And this is why the Silent Samurai valued solitude above comfort, because solitude builds a foundation that cannot be shaken by rejection, silence, or uncertainty. And when you reach this stage, you no longer fear being alone. You fear losing yourself in noise again. Because the power you gain from solitude is quiet, stable, and permanent. And once it is built, it stays with you whether you are alone or surrounded by the world. After solitude becomes familiar rather than threatening, a deeper shift begins that most people never experience, because this phase requires consistency without reward, discipline without applause, and presence without stimulation. And it is here that solitude stops feeling like a place you visit and becomes a state you carry with you. Because once you are comfortable alone, you no longer depend on environments to regulate your emotions, and this is where true confidence is born. Not the loud kind that performs, but the quiet kind that remains steady regardless of circumstances. And this steadiness forms because solitude exposes patterns that social noise hides. The moments when you procrastinate, when you lie to yourself, when you avoid discomfort, and when your actions don't match your intentions. And instead of escaping these realizations, the Silent Samurai stays with them, because self-respect is built by confronting inconsistency, not avoiding it. And over time, solitude becomes a mirror that sharpens discipline, because without distraction, every excuse becomes visible. And when excuses are visible, they lose power. And as discipline forms quietly in isolation, something unexpected happens. Your identity stabilizes. You stop shifting personalities to fit rooms, stop borrowing confidence from others, and stop comparing your path to timelines that don't belong to you. And this internal stability changes how you move, how you speak, and how you respond to pressure, because you are no longer fragmented. And fragmentation is what creates anxiety, hesitation, and self-doubt. But solitude consolidates identity into something singular and grounded. And this is why people who master solitude appear calm even in chaos, because chaos does not disrupt what is internally ordered. And the samurai understood that control over the inner world eliminates the need to control the outer one. And as this phase deepens, you begin to experience a new relationship with time. Boredom no longer feels unbearable, waiting no longer feels urgent, and stillness no longer feels empty, because you have learned to occupy your own presence fully. And this capacity gives you an advantage most people don't realize exists: patience. Because patience is not passive, it is power that comes from not needing immediate stimulation or outcome. And this power allows you to make decisions slowly, strategically, and without emotional pressure. And when you move this way, mistakes decrease, clarity increases, and confidence becomes unshakable, because it is no longer tied to performance or perception. And this is the stage where solitude stops being about isolation and starts becoming about mastery. Mastery over impulse, over emotion, and over identity. And once mastery is established, you no longer fear being misunderstood, overlooked, or alone, because you have already faced the hardest environment possible, your own mind, without distraction, and survived. And when you survive that environment repeatedly, strength stops being theoretical and becomes embodied. And embodied strength cannot be taken from you by criticism, rejection, or silence, because it was forged where none of those things mattered. When solitude is fully integrated, its effects extend beyond your inner world and quietly reshape how others experience you. Because emotional independence is not invisible, it is felt through presence, restraint, and non-reactivity. And people may not understand why they feel different around you, but they will sense that you are not seeking anything from them. And this changes the psychological balance instantly, because most social dynamics are built on exchange: attention for validation, reaction for approval, noise for connection. But when you are comfortable alone, you disrupt these unspoken contracts, and disruption creates tension in those who rely on emotional dependency to feel relevant. And this is why some people will withdraw, others will test you, and a few will respect you deeply. And the silent samurai accepts all three responses without attachment, because his stability does not depend on how others react. And this neutrality is what gives solitude its final form of power: authority without force. Because authority that needs reinforcement is not authority, it is insecurity disguised as control. And when you carry solitude within you, you do not argue, convince, or perform. You allow behavior to reveal alignment or misalignment naturally. And this simplifies relationships dramatically, because those who respect boundaries remain, those who need access leave, and those who test receive calm distance instead of emotional engagement. And this teaches people how to treat you without a single confrontation. And as this continues, your energy becomes protected, your focus sharpens, and your life becomes quieter but stronger. Because silence is no longer something that happens to you, it is something you choose. And this choice separates you from the constant emotional noise that exhausts most people. And this is the point where solitude becomes freedom, not from people, but from emotional dependency. Because you can engage fully without losing yourself, connect deeply without attachment, and walk away without resentment. And the samurai understood that this freedom is the highest form of power, because a person who does not need validation cannot be controlled, rushed, or manipulated. And once you reach this stage, you stop fearing loneliness entirely, because loneliness comes from needing others to complete you,
while solitude comes from already being complete. And completeness allows you to stand alone without fear, to connect without desperation, and to move forward without permission. And this is why being comfortable alone is not the absence of connection. It is the foundation of healthy connection. Because only those who can stand alone without fear can choose others without dependency. And when you embody this truth, your presence becomes rare, grounded, and unmistakably strong. And without saying a word, you signal to the world that you are not waiting to be filled, approved, or saved. You are already whole. And that is the silent power most people spend their entire lives searching for, without realizing it was built in solitude all along.
The moment you stop needing people the way you once did, something subtle but undeniable begins to shift in your environment. Because need was never just emotional, it was structural. It was the invisible glue that held certain relationships together. And when that glue dissolves, the structure weakens. And many people mistake this collapse for betrayal, when in reality it is exposure. Because what you are witnessing is not people turning against you, but people losing leverage. And leverage is what many relationships quietly run on. Not connection, not loyalty, not even affection, but emotional access and psychological dependency. And when you become self-respecting, internally anchored, and no longer available for regulation, that access closes. And those who benefited from it feel destabilized. Not because you changed into something worse, but because you changed into something independent. And independence removes utility. And when utility disappears, resentment often replaces affection. And this is why self-respect carries a social cost that few talk about. Because as long as you are accommodating, explainable, predictable, and emotionally available on demand, you are easy to integrate, easy to influence, and easy to keep comfortable. But once you stop over-explaining, stop chasing validation, stop softening your boundaries, and stop performing emotional labor for others, the system around you recalibrates, and those who relied on your reactions feel the loss immediately. Because you are no longer stabilizing their insecurities, their identity, or their sense of control. And this loss triggers quiet hostility, not always loud confrontation, but subtle withdrawal, misinterpretation, passive aggression, and narrative shifts. Because people rarely say they miss your need, they say you changed. And this accusation is not a moral judgment, it is a grief response. Because the version of you that made them feel secure is gone, and the new version no longer negotiates identity through approval. And this is where many people break their own self-respect, rushing to reassure, to explain their growth, to soften their edges, and to make themselves smaller again just to restore harmony. But harmony built on dependency is not peace, it is containment. And the disciplined individual learns to sit through this phase without collapsing back into old patterns, understanding that distance is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is the natural outcome of self-alignment. And the samurai understood that when you stand upright internally, you become harder to lean on, and those who leaned too heavily will stumble. And rather than blaming gravity, they blame the pillar. And this is the phase where self-respect is tested, not through hardship, but through social friction. Because nothing reveals the true foundation of relationships faster than your refusal to overextend yourself. And as you hold this line, the environment begins to show you who was connected to your essence and who was attached to your availability. And this distinction, once seen, cannot be unseen. Because you realize that much of what felt like loyalty was actually access, and much of what felt like support was actually regulation. And when that ends, the turning begins. Not because you became cold, but because you stopped being useful in the way they needed. And this is the unspoken price of self-respect, that clarity replaces comfort, and silence replaces negotiation, and standing alone becomes easier than bending again. What most people don't expect is that once the turning begins, it doesn't come with explosions or dramatic endings. It comes quietly, through absence, through changed tone, through conversations that feel slightly off.
because people rarely confront what they cannot control. They retreat, reframe, and rationalize. And the disciplined individual notices this not with bitterness, but with precision, understanding that social ecosystems self-correct. And when you remove yourself as an emotional resource, others must adapt. And adaptation often feels like rejection before it feels like growth. And this is where the difference between ego and self-respect becomes clear, because ego demands acknowledgement, explanation, and closure, while self-respect accepts reality without forcing interpretation. And the samurai never chased closure, because closure is often just another attempt to regain influence. And instead, he observed who adjusted with respect and who withdrew with resentment. And this observation revealed a deeper truth, that healthy connections evolve when need dissolves, while unhealthy ones collapse. And this collapse is not a failure, it is filtration. And filtration is painful only if you are attached to outcomes rather than alignment. And as this filtration completes, something unexpected happens. The emotional noise decreases, the internal clarity sharpens, and a new standard forms, not because you demanded better treatment, but because you stopped tolerating less. And people respond to standards even when they resist them. And over time, the same individuals who quietly turned away either return with a different posture or remain distant permanently. And both outcomes are acceptable, because self-respect is not a negotiation, it is a position. And this position attracts fewer people but higher integrity, fewer conversations but deeper presence, and fewer reactions but stronger boundaries. And this is why self-respect eventually feels peaceful, not lonely, because loneliness comes from abandonment of self, not from separation from others. And the samurai learned that being misunderstood is lighter than being misaligned, and being alone is safer than being consumed. And when you stop needing people to validate your direction, your pace, or your discipline, you gain something far more stable, internal authority. And authority does not beg, explain, or chase, it stands. And those who recognize it approach with respect, while those who depended on your need fade into distance. And this distance is not punishment, it is resolution, because relationships built on dependency cannot survive self-respect, and relationships built on respect do not require need. And once you fully understand this, the turning no longer hurts, it clarifies, because you realize they didn't turn on you, they simply couldn't follow you where you went, and you no longer needed them to.
After the turning has happened and the distance has settled, a quieter phase begins, one that few people talk about because it lacks drama but carries the most weight. The phase where you stop scanning the room for reactions, stop measuring your growth against who stayed or left, and stop interpreting silence as loss, because by now your nervous system has recalibrated, and what once felt like rejection now feels like space. And space allows observation, and observation reveals patterns that were invisible when you were emotionally involved. And this is where you begin to notice how much energy you used to spend managing other people's comfort, smoothing tensions that were never yours, explaining decisions that didn't require permission, and adjusting your pace to avoid making others feel left behind. And once that energy returns to you, something stabilizes internally, a sense of forward gravity, where movement feels natural rather than forced. And the samurai recognized this phase as the return of center, because when you are no longer pulled by approval or resistance, your actions align effortlessly with your values. And this alignment creates consistency without struggle, because you are no longer splitting attention between self-direction and social maintenance. And the people who remain in your orbit during this phase behave differently. They don't question your boundaries. They don't demand access. They don't require constant reassurance, because respect has replaced dependency. And respect does not need maintenance. It only needs consistency. And this shift feels subtle but profound, because conversations become cleaner, expectations become clearer, and emotional exchanges lose their volatility. And at the same time, you begin to notice the absence of those who thrived on reaction. And this absence no longer creates doubt, because clarity has replaced confusion, and clarity removes the impulse to chase. And the most dangerous mistake here is mistaking this calm for stagnation and attempting to reintroduce noise just to feel movement. But the disciplined individual understands that silence is not emptiness, it is compression, and compression precedes force. And this is where internal authority matures, because you are no longer proving independence, you are living it, and living it quietly is what separates temporary detachment from permanent self-respect. Because true self-respect does not announce itself, it is felt through consistency, through predictability of principles, and through the absence of emotional bargaining. And when you reach this phase, even conflict changes, because you no longer argue to win, you disengage to protect alignment. And disengagement is not avoidance, it is selection, and selection is power. Because you cannot be pulled into dynamics you no longer feed. And this is why the samurai did not fear being alone, because solitude sharpened awareness, and awareness sharpened judgment, and judgment protected direction. And at this stage, direction becomes non-negotiable, not because you are rigid, but because you are clear, and clarity does not bend to accommodate confusion. Eventually, you arrive at the final realization, one that reframes the entire journey, that self-respect was never about distancing from people, it was about removing internal dependency. And once dependency dissolves, relationships reorder themselves naturally, without confrontation, without declarations, without emotional reckoning. And this is where peace becomes durable rather than temporary, because it no longer depends on how others behave, respond, or interpret you. And this independence creates a quiet authority that people sense before they understand, because humans instinctively respond to those who are not seeking extraction, approval, or validation. And this is why over time, new connections form with less friction and more mutual respect, because you are no longer advertising emotional availability as a currency. You are offering presence selectively. And presence given freely is far more powerful than presence given out of need. And at this point, even criticism loses its edge, because criticism relies on leverage, and leverage disappears when identity is internally sourced. And the samurai knew that when no one can move you emotionally, no one can control you strategically. And this freedom does not make like standing on firm ground while noise collapses around you. Silence builds unbreakable authority because over time it teaches others how to treat you without you having to instruct them, argue with them, or demand respect. And this happens not through intimidation, but through consistency, because silence paired with aligned action creates a psychological weight that words never can. And at first, people test it, filling the quiet with assumptions, projections, and subtle provocations, hoping to pull a reaction out of you, because reaction gives them leverage, clarity, and emotional access. But when no reaction comes, when silence remains calm and steady, something shifts. Confusion replaces confidence, and uncertainty replaces control. Because people are used to negotiating behavior through emotion, and silence removes negotiation entirely. And the silent samurai allowed this process to unfold naturally, never rushing to re-engage, never explaining his restraint, and never justifying his distance, because he understood that authority is not declared, it is observed. And silence gives people space to observe your consistency without distraction. And over time, the same silence that once triggered discomfort begins to command respect, not because you demanded it, but because reliability signals strength, and strength signals safety. And this is why silence eventually attracts a different quality of interaction: fewer words, more intention; fewer tests, more trust, because people subconsciously recognize that emotional manipulation no longer works and that presence must replace pressure. And this transformation only occurs if silence is maintained without bitterness, without superiority, and without resentment, because resentment leaks need, and need weakens silence. But neutral silence, silence without emotional charge, becomes untouchable. And at this level, you stop monitoring how you are perceived, because perception is unstable and temporary, while character is stable and cumulative. And the Silent Samurai focused only on character, on alignment between values and behavior, because alignment creates coherence, and coherence creates authority. And authority does not require volume, it requires integrity. And this is why silence eventually feels light, because you stop carrying the burden of being understood, and that freedom unlocks a deeper calm, one that cannot be shaken by criticism or praise, because both lose their influence. And this shift changes how you move through the world: slower speech, fewer words, clearer decisions, and sharper awareness. And people sense this shift immediately, even if they can't explain it, because calm presence is felt before it is analyzed. And this is the completion of the Silent Samurai path, where discipline no longer feels heavy, consistency no longer feels isolating, and silence no longer feels threatening, because you are no longer waiting for permission to be yourself. And the final realization arrives quietly, that silence was never about withdrawing from the world. It was about withdrawing from noise, from unnecessary reactions, from borrowed opinions, and from emotional dependency. And once that withdrawal is complete, you don't disappear, you stabilize. And stability is what most people unconsciously seek, admire, and follow. Because in a world addicted to noise, the quietest presence often holds the most power. And those who can remain silent without shrinking, without explaining, and without disengaging from their values have already passed the final test, because silence did not weaken them, it revealed who they were all along.